Oh, hey, a fellow human being. Hi, good to see you. Like you, I too am a normal human being, and today I want to discuss Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. I want to specifically discuss the performance issues of the game, and not necessarily just each individual aspect, but bigger causes that correlate to the conceptual decisions and the design decisions. It's not really one or two things that cause the performance issues in this game. It's the decision overall, and it's a bit of the core concept of the game itself resulted in the performance issues. I want to discuss the philosophy that fidelity is not quality. We're in a point in the industry right now where publishers are trying to tell us, they're trying to convince us that fidelity is quality, so they can make things like, look at this 4K, look at this AI upscale, look at all these fancy, this is so high res, look at this. That does not make quality. It does not make a good game. It does not make a good experience for the player. So for me, I am a commercial developer. I have launched around 11 commercial titles or so between the 3DS, the Wii U, and the Switch. I have a number of commercial titles that I am finishing up and preparing to launch very soon, but also I make free homebrew games as well. So if you've got favorite old consoles like PSP, DS, Vita, all those old consoles, I still make games for those. That's my way to thank you guys for supporting me, for buying my games and enjoying them, for telling people about my games. I make free homebrew games for you guys as well. So I want to start with one of the most important design decisions that I see here that has had the biggest impact on this game overall, and that is interactable grass, and that has resulted in a serious issue. And the reason why that is, it looks fantastic, right? But this goes back to the philosophy that fidelity is not quality. It looks great, right? This looks fantastic. I really like this, but the problem with the interactable grass is that it has performance implications. The grass can be cut. If I perform an attack, you can see that the grass can be cut down. We get some particle effects. The grass can also be set on fire. And this is done to make the game feel like Breath of the Wild. And the problem with that is Breath of the Wild is about interacting with your environment. And Hyrule Warriors, or Warriors games, are not about interacting with the environment. They're about beating up a bunch of enemies, a lot of them, and look really cool while doing it. So there is a problem already, because this is a design decision that doesn't necessarily synergize with the core game concept. And there is an issue here. Because the grass has to interact with your attacks, it can be set on fire. Because it's interactable, there's a significant performance cost. The player character can also interact with the grass in terms of their body box. It's hard to see here with the tall grass, but after you cut the grass and you look below, you can see that Link has a collider box that does actually interact. If you have a look at that, the grass underneath Link does actually bend when he's standing over it. I believe the little robot can interact with that as well. The enemies do not interact with it. That would take significantly more processing power, which is why we don't see that. So because the grass has to be interactable, it has to take into account those things. It's constantly processing those. There is a sense of translucency. As you can see, when the sun, the light source is on the other side of the grass, it has a sense of translucency or a sense of simulated subsurface scattering. That's where light enters a surface, bounces around, and comes out the surface, and it gives it a sense of depth. It looks fantastic. It's wonderful visually, and because that's what Breath of the Wild does. But the reason why these decisions would have been made is because whoever was in charge of directing the game would have decided that. They would have said, we want this game to look like Breath of the Wild. We want to tell the player this is Breath of the Wild. All of these decisions are thus because the game is trying to tell you something, and they're trying to tell you this is just like Breath of the Wild. Look at it. This is a prequel to the story of Breath of the Wild. People tend to debate whether or not the game is canonical to the story. I don't really care about that much in terms of whether it's canon or not. But because they're the developers, not the developers, the people in charge are trying to draw a correlation between Breath of the Wild. Also, I don't want to sound cynical here, but Breath of the Wild sold extremely well, so why not make a game that draws on the iconography and the identifiable traits of Breath of the Wild? So here they're trying to show you this game is just like Breath of the Wild. Every mesh in the game can become transparent when they are sort of too close to the camera. You can see as the soldiers get between the player character and the camera, they become transparent. There is a fading process that occurs, and that is all a performance cost. There are calculations that have to be done. That is true for the foliage as well. But to me, I don't see that oh, there is a transition as well. But most of the time it occurs so fast that you don't even realize that there is a smooth transition for the transparency. So these are situations where the game is doing things that have a cost on performance and there really isn't a benefit to it. Whether those characters just instantly become slightly transparent or not, it's so hard to notice that there's no point in them doing it because there is a performance cost. And also the fact that anything can become transparent means that that object is more expensive to draw when it comes to transparency. What I do find very funny is that I did find an object that does not do that. It is this particular kind of bush here. Is you can get close to the camera and it doesn't fade. And this is why this kind of decision making, I think, it's ruining a lot of modern games because they're using this sort of transparency. The thing is, people are not stupid. People know that you use the right analog stick to control the camera. People know that if something is in your way of the camera, you can walk for half a second and that thing will be out of the way of the camera. So my personal opinion on the matter, even though this is not an opinion piece, is that there is no need to have this transparency because you are making every single object in your game more expensive to render. Overall, your game will have just worse performance because you want the object to fade and become transparent when it comes close to the camera, but there is no need for that. Players know that they can just move the camera. So in my personal games, I never use that because it means that I can use my performance budget for other things. Now, this is an example of a stage where the performance gets the absolute worst, and I'm using a character that has one of the worst performance costs. So it's a bit hard to tell in the lighting in this stage, but you can tell some of the design considerations or the performance considerations is that the grass only renders so far. One of the things that this game does that causes so many issues is that there's always transparent effects on the screens, whether it's dust or little glowy orbs. It's very obvious here, but say for example in the previous stage you could see many slightly transparent orbs floating around the screen just to give the scene a bit of depth and interest, but all of that has a performance cost. Now, the Switch has some quirks as hardware, and basically its weakest point is drawing transparent particles on screen or transparent pixels on screen. That has the highest performance cost. It's interesting that in Breath of the Wild on the Wii U, there are certain scenes where Breath of the Wild performs better because the Wii U was a bit better at rendering transparent pixels than the Switch, which seems strange, but that's just what is one of the quirks of the Switch. Here we have the rain effects. We have water on the ground, which has a huge cost. Water is quite expensive to render, and the problem with water is even if you cannot actually see it, it can still be rendering. Say, for example, if I'm over here and I can't really see the water anymore because there is terrain in the way, it's still being rendered, which means there is still a performance cost there. That's a little problematic for something that is so expensive to render. Something I noticed in this game as well is that environmental shadows can actually be cast from quite far away. In general, for 3D games, when we want to try to save on performance, we will have the game stop drawing shadows at a particular distance, but I noticed in this game it actually draws quite far. So now I'm going to start performing some character attacks, and we'll see what some of the issues are. Some characters have particle effects on their attacks that have a high amount of transparency. And it's not just that these particle effects are transparent, it's also that they are performing extra calculations so they can look either brighter or darker, and it affects the way that they are drawn. It's what gives that really cool slashing effect, that brightness. That has a performance cost, and unfortunately it's actually a little bit expensive. Well, I say a little bit, it's actually quite expensive on the Switch, and you'll see the frame rate really chugs here. And that is not taking into account that the enemies have their own particle effects. You can see this guy has his own thing, and the frame rate is really crawling right now. And to me, it's unpleasant. I don't want to criticize my colleagues in the industry who are working on these games, and I'm sure were so many mandates. I think this was a unique project for the developers to work on, because I'm certain that there were so many mandates. They worked closely with Nintendo, and I don't know things behind the scenes. I don't have any behind the scenes knowledge or information on the development of this game, but I can only surmise that Nintendo had mandated they wanted the game to be something very specific, and they wanted to make sure the game adhered to those requirements. And I'm certain that some of the priorities would be the game has to look and feel like Breath of the Wild. Things like this in the environment that indicate that you can pick up items, that has performance implications because of those particle effects. When you have many items that are sitting around that need to be picked up, they contribute to all of that. So it's the rain, it is the particle effects, it's the water on the ground, it's your character. And now I'm going to press the A button, and we'll see one of the biggest issues. So some of the biggest issues that we see are full screen effects. I'm going to press the A button here, and I'll point out what I mean. Is we now have some blurring with depth of field where the background becomes blurrier. We have chromatic aberration, and we have even more particle effects. So any kind of blurring, especially depth of field, where that blurs the background and it keeps the foreground in focus. Blurred edges or depth of field, it's still quite expensive. And chromatic aberration, those are all things that are very expensive to render. And when your characters use their special attacks, that really comes into play, and it becomes significantly more noticeable. You can see that blurring on the edges. Now, an even bigger problem comes when you play this in two-player mode. I tried to play this game with a friend with whom I enjoyed the first Hyrule Warriors games. We played a heap of the first Hyrule Warriors games. We played it on the Wii U, and it had performance issues there. And on the Switch, the performance was overall better. The developers were able to fine-tune it and make it even better. And we tried to play this game, and it was very difficult to play the game, because the performance issues. And when you have two characters that their special attacks will always cause the game to slow down, it's problematic. And with the friend that I was playing this game with, we had to coordinate who was going to use a special attack. There were moments where we both used special attacks at the same time, and the game went to single-digit frame rates, basically. And so we had to coordinate and say, okay, don't do anything. We had to tell the other person to just stop attacking. And I would say, don't do anything, I'm going to use my special attack, and there were moments where we could tell, if some other player was using a lot of special attacks or fancy attacks, we would say to each other, hey, can I have some frame rate, and so the other player would stop doing stuff, and we would let the other player have some frame rate. And it's problematic if your players have to do that. If your players have to manually on their own, if they have to budget the frame rate, if they have to ask the other player to share some of the frame rate with them, it's problematic. This is a stage that really, really chugs. We'll scoot back and we'll see just how far. Oh, I can't go very far in this stage, can I? This looks quite nice. It's so nicely detailed. The problem is that fidelity is not quality, and there were other considerations that should have been made here. One of my concerns with the full screen effects, such as the blurring, the chromatic aberration, the depth of field, which it looks like it is depth of field. One of my concerns with that is that potentially the effect may not ever be fully disabled. We see it gradually fade in and out in terms of the strength of the effect when certain actions are taken. That programmatically would be controlled to say, fade in and fade out. There is a chance that the effect is being weakened and strengthened, but there's a chance that the effect may not actually be turned off or disabled as part of the rendering stack, which means that it still has a performance cost even though it's not visible on screen. There's a chance that that is still happening, because when I see this game, I see a game that should not be running this slow. Even in the most basic scenes, there are still performance issues, and to me as a developer working and having worked on a number of things on the Switch, it shouldn't be like this, just what I'm looking at here. There is a quirk to animating the heads-up display. Now, I'm not sure which engine was used to create this game. I have heard rumors that Warriors games, the modern Warriors games, are created in Unity. I'm not sure how true that is. I don't know the team personally behind who's creating this, but one of the issues with Unity's game engine, and it's always been this way, and any change on your heads-up display, or what is referred to as a canvas, having any change marks everything that is on your heads-up display as dirty, which means the game engine has to redraw the entire heads-up display. That is a huge performance cost. I cannot overstate how ridiculously slow that makes your game run when it comes to performance. So, if your developers are not aware of that kind of quirk, having anything animated on the heads-up display means you have a massive performance cost for what is basically nothing. You are sacrificing a huge chunk of your game's performance for literally nothing. Now, something that is always on screen is that animating beeping dot. You have your map as well, and if the developers are not careful about how they set up their heads-up display, that means that the more things you have on the heads-up display, the more performance implications, the heavier cost it has. Everything has to be redrawn because of one thing changing. And if you have that animated on every single frame like it is, that is resulting in a huge performance cost. I cannot overstate what a problem that is. One solution to that is to cut up every piece of your heads-up display, and as a developer you need to understand which elements need to be animated and which elements do not need to be animated, and have them separated into different canvases. They need to be totally separate, so that way whatever is animated has its own canvas, and that's the only thing that needs to be marked as dirty on the canvas, which means that's the only element that needs to be redrawn. Otherwise, you are causing a huge slowdown, and depending on the platform and how much memory you have, it can cause memory leakage, it can cause memory fragmentation, it can eventually cause your game to just get slower and slower until it crashes. This is a problem that Unity has. It's something that was a massive problem on the 3DS, but these days, because we have so much more RAM, it's less of a problem when it comes to fragmentation, but it will always be a performance problem. Now, sadly, a character like this just has more built-in performance costs over the other characters. I love just the weird characters. I'm always going to pick the weirdest character I can, but having the water pool as part of the character already has a performance cost, and having attacks that are so big, like you can see this is problematic because there are so many transparent particle effects, but also this entire stage is rendering water basically everywhere you look, which is already a problem for the Switch, because this whole stage is just chugging. This is chugging, and it's struggling to have any performance at all. Something I notice is the game does not appear to use volumetric lighting. Volumetric lighting is an advanced form of atmospheric lighting where we simulate a sense of moisture and density in the atmosphere. You can see sort of light rays coming through trees and things like that. It makes games feel deep and complex in terms of its visuals. It's so pleasing to the eye, but it's very expensive, especially on the Switch. One way to fake volumetric lighting is to use fog. I believe this game is using fog to very good effect because it gives it a sense of volumetric lighting. You can see things sort of fade out into the distance, and that is a good use of what is simpler basic technology because fog is quite simple. It doesn't have a huge performance cost, and that is one of the performance considerations, which is, I think, is a good decision. If they had gone for true volumetric lighting, the game would be probably, you know, a third or even half of the frame rate that it is now, combining with all of the other elements that we see right now. All of that stuff sort of stacks. One performance consideration that I can really respect here is the use of inverse kinematics for the non-player characters, for the enemy characters. In this situation, when I say inverse kinematics, I am describing the way that the game allows the character's legs to adjust to the slope that they are standing on. It's more noticeable when a character is standing on stairs, where you can see one leg, you know, steps up onto the stair so that their leg doesn't go through the terrain. That has a performance cost. There's quite some mathematical calculations that have to go on in order to get that to work. In general, that it works really well here. It's a little hard to see because Zelda has a sort of closed off stance with her legs, but you can see that her feet are sort of adapting to the slope, whereas the enemy characters do not. If the enemy characters stand on a slope, their legs will actually go through the slope, which is not a bad thing, because if all of the enemies used inverse kinematics, it would have a huge performance cost and the game would run even worse. If we have a look at him here, you'll see his legs sort of go through the slope there as he's standing there. So if we can get him to walk towards us. There you can see his leg clipping into the terrain. That is not something to complain about. That is good. It is good that the enemies do not use inverse kinematics. I think a less experienced developer with less concerns for performance implications would have made it so that the character would have inverse kinematics. Problematically, we're seeing depth of field blurring here, and this has a huge performance cost. You see when you've locked onto a target and the background blurs, that's expensive. That is one of the most expensive effects for the Nintendo Switch. Despite how nice it looks, despite how cool it looks, locking onto your target causes that. I think if I unlock... I'm starting to remember now when I was playing this multiplayer with a friend, he told me to stop using Zelda and stop using the Kanata or whatever the Sage was. I wasn't allowed to use those in two-player because these characters are so hungry for the frame rate. You can see when I do not lock onto the enemy, I do not have the depth of field. So here's a pro tip for this game. If you want better frame rate, do not lock onto the enemies if you want to better frame rate. You can see once I lock onto the enemy here, once I've locked onto him, the background blurs and the frame rate drops as a result. I have a feeling, again, that even though the effect is turned down, there is a possibility that it still has performance cost, even though the effect is down, because even if it's just sitting there idle, it can still have an effect on the performance. So I just want to quickly now look at the previous Hyrule Warriors games, which I really enjoy. I really like the first Hyrule Warriors games. Let's go ahead and have a look at that. This is the previous Hyrule Warrior games, and you can see that the gameplay is in every way significantly more fluid, the performance is significantly superior, and while the graphical style is simpler and there's less detail in the environments, the gameplay itself is fluid, the frame rate stays quite good, and there are significantly more enemies on screen. Attacks can still be big and flashy, but they don't cause the game's performance to bottom out. At the end of the day, here's how I would summarize this video. In terms of things that can actually be done to improve the frame rate and the overall performance of this, I would honestly get rid of this fading transition where the characters can go transparent. And personally, I would remove the ability for things to go transparent overall. Here's why we have to do that as developers, though, is that when things go too close to the camera, they can actually clip into the camera. But what I would do, and what I've done in my games, I've implemented logic where the character just turns invisible. Instead of doing this transparency thing, where we have to use mathematical calculations in order to make things go transparent as they get closer to the camera, remove that from the shader, the character's shader, remove that because that has a performance cost. I would use programmatic logic when the character gets closer to the camera, just go invisible. Don't draw those meshes. I would implement that for the characters and whatnot. There's going to be a cost for that for other objects. You've got to do something about that because that's one of the biggest performance costs here. Like you can see the camera gets close to the hay bale, and let's see what happens. So the hay bale does not fade. We can go inside, and this is not a problem. It's technically an issue, but it's not a problem because when that happens, the player knows that they can move the camera. It's intuitive. The player knows they can do that. So having it go inside is not an issue. That is not an issue. So implement that for the characters. All of the enemies should be like that. Even if the camera goes inside the enemies, who cares? Because it's not an issue. Let the camera do that because it's going to result in much better performance. Let it go inside the player character because it's going to result in better performance for the game. I would cut back on the transparent particles, reduce the amount of transparent particles. Look at what's going on the stage. We have all these little transparent balls flying around. I would personally, I would remove that. I would significantly reduce the number of those on screen. There are a lot. If it's so important, you know, you can keep it if it's that important to the end product, but significantly reduce the number of that. I would remove the interactability with the grass. At this point, it doesn't add anything to the game that you can cut the grass, that you can set it on fire, and that the character's body box can sort of flatten the grass a little bit. It doesn't add anything to this game. It does not make the game better. Removing it will not make the game worse. So I would remove the interactability with the grass. It does not help. It does not make the game better. It's making the game worse because of all the performance issues. Personally, I would remove the depth of field effect. This is so expensive. Take that out entirely. You do not need it. It's such an issue that when you lock onto the enemy, it really ramps up that effect. Take that out entirely. I would have the draw distance for shadows be less because the game does draw shadows from pretty far away. We see other games where you can actually see the shadows sort of fading in and out from a distance. You need to implement that in this game because in this game, it's all about fighting the enemies. It's less about the immersion with the environment. These Warriors games are not necessarily about immersion. They're about beating up enemies, and beating up the enemies is not fun when the frame rate is miserable. It's a very low frame rate. I would also reduce the resolution of the shadows because the shadow resolution that I'm seeing, it's very high. If you have a look at Zelda, those are very high resolution shadows. You can see here the resolution of the shadows on the fence here is a bit lower. I would overall, you can see the resolution on that guy. His shadow resolution is lower than Zelda's. So I think all the player characters have higher resolution shadows. Go ahead and reduce that. Reduce the resolution on those shadows as well and make the distance for shadows drawn lower. Overall, I would make sure that when full screen effects like blurring and all that, when they are not needed, that they are properly disabled. I may have missed a couple things. Do you guys have your own thoughts? I would like to hear from you in the comments if you have noticed things that I did not notice. If you found this interesting, please let me know. On screen here, you can see a couple of the games that I've made that are available on Switch right now. You can grab them on the eShop. I just launched Clasher Ball, which is my action puzzle game. I made it hoping it would feel like some arcade game you would find in the early 2000s. I hope you'll give that a try. There's some free demos, and you can also get a free version for the PS Vita. You can grab that from my itch.io page. I'm finishing up a couple of my other commercial titles and also even more free homebrew games. I just want to thank my patrons who make it possible for me to spend time making all these free homebrew games. I am working on stuff for the Game Gear, the Lynx. I'm going to start working on Saturn. homebrew later this year, and I've got even more coming for the PSP and the Vita. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please take care of yourselves. I'll see you around.